The Philippines is a group of more than 7,000 islands located in the Pacific Ocean. Lies on a subduction zone within the Ring of Fire, a geologic belt encircling the Pacific Ocean, which is responsible for much of the seismic activity experienced from Japan to Alaska to California. This geological background has made the islands rich in minerals, but also requires inhabitants to cope with the destructive potential of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Out of the 7,000 islands, only about 1,000 are inhabited, with most of them being around 1 square mile in size. The archipelago is divided into 3 island groups: Luzon, the Visayas, and Mindanao. Mindanao is the southernmost group of islands, the Visayas are situated in the central region, and Luzon is the northernmost group, named after the largest island in both the group and the entire Philippines. Luzon is the most populous island and includes the capital city, Manila. The earliest evidence of Homo sapiens, or modern humans, dates back to around 47,000 years ago. Before them, there were earlier hominids, Homo luzonensis, discovered near Luzon, which dates to approximately 134,000 years ago. Additionally, evidence suggests that Homo erectus inhabited the islands as far back as 700,000 years ago. By around 3000 BCE, the ancestors of the modern native population had settled in the Philippines, having migrated from Taiwan, other nearby islands, and the Asian mainland. They were Austronesian, a socio-cultural and language group spread across maritime Southeast Asia, extending as far west as Madagascar. Austronesian is the root language for Malay, Indonesian, Taiwanese, Tagalog, and various other languages spoken throughout the South Pacific Islands. Early Philippine settlements were usually situated along rivers and were often isolated due to the region's geography. As a result, they did not form a unified political structure but maintained their communities through intermarriage and other kinship relationships. By 2000 BCE, trade between the islands and the mainland was well established. This is evidenced by the presence of Philippine jade artifacts found throughout the region and metal goods produced using techniques similar to those from India. These objects, along with the ideas and people who carried them, traveled through the maritime Jade Road, an extensive trade network that existed for about 3,000 years until 1000 CE. The last 1,500 years of this era seem to have been a period of extended peace throughout the Philippine Islands and the surrounding regions. This is partly evidenced by the thriving trade network and also by the scarcity of archaeological finds showing human bones with signs of violent death. However, such evidence may still be undiscovered. Written history in the Philippines starts around 900 CE, with the earliest known document being the Laguna copperplate inscription, which details the forgiveness of a debt. By this period, the inhabitants of the archipelago had started organizing into socio-political units known as barangays. These were similar to city-states and could range in size from as few as 30 people to as many as 500. Some of these barangays formed confederacies, ruled by a paramount leader chosen from among the datus, the leaders of the allied polities. In regions with significant contact with the Indian subcontinent, the rulers were called rajas. Later, in areas that adopted Islam, these leaders were referred to as sultans. Within these barangays, society was organized into classes. The highest class was the Maginu, or ruling class, followed by the freemen known as the Maharlika, and finally the enslaved class called the Alipin. Each class had subcategories to further define a person's status. The early cultures of the Philippines practiced polytheistic animism, believing that all things possess a spirit that must be respected and cared for to maintain good fortune and avoid misfortune. Ancestor worship was also a part of this belief system, with ancestors sometimes taking on the forms of animals and vice versa. Magic and witchcraft were widely believed to have significant influence, and those who practiced them were often highly respected and/or greatly feared. Buddhism and Hinduism were introduced to the Filipinos before the 9th century CE. Archaeological findings and documents from China and India reveal that certain Philippine barangays and islands paid tribute to the Srivijaya Empire, a dominant Indonesian Buddhist state that managed maritime trade in the area from the 6th to the 13th century. This influence was followed by that of the Majapahit Empire, a Hindu-Buddhist state based on the island of Java. Both Buddhism and Hinduism impacted the local belief systems and culture. The spread of these religions was facilitated by the linguistic connections between the Philippines and Indian Sanskrit. Islam was introduced to the Philippines in 1380 by a missionary named Makhdum Karim. Accompanying merchants, he preached Sunni Islam to the inhabitants of the Sulu archipelago and is credited with establishing the first mosque in the Philippines. A decade later, he was followed by the Indonesian Minangkabau Prince Raja Baguinda, who also established the Sulu Sultanate. In the early 15th century, the Chinese mariner Zheng He established Chinese Muslim communities in the Philippines. The history of the Philippines is commonly categorized into pre-colonial and post-colonial eras. Most of the knowledge about the period before the Spanish arrival is derived from the chronicles and records of other nations, especially China. Some of these references are brief or merely noted in trade records, while others offer more detailed insights. The oldest recorded barangay is Tondo, a major polity located on the Pasig River Delta in present-day Manila Bay. Tondo was associated with the nearby barangay of Maynila, an independent entity with which it shared trade monopolies throughout Southeast Asia. The trade was significant enough to the Chinese that under the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty, a governor was appointed to oversee it. In fact, the majority of the documented information we have about pre-colonial Philippines is derived from the records of other countries that interacted with the various barangays. China offers the most detailed records, but there is supporting information from Japan, Champa, India, and other sources. By the early 16th century, this kingdom had declined and was overtaken by the Luzon. The Luzon people, who lived around Tondo, seized the opportunity presented by Brunei's conquest to establish their dominance. They had a militaristic culture and participated in conflicts throughout the Philippines, Indonesia, and mainland Asia, sometimes representing their state, and other times acting as individual mercenaries or groups. Another well-documented state is the Sultanate of Sulu. Although the society existed before the introduction of Islam and its political terminology, it adopted the name Sultanate later on. During the 12th and 13th centuries, inhabitants of the Visayas region migrated to the Sulu archipelago in Mindanao. They established their state and engaged in widespread trade across the region, including with the people of Champa on the Indonesian peninsula. Some of these Champa people eventually settled in Sulu as well. In the 12th century, a brief war occurred between the Sulu and the Champa. After the conflict, trade was quickly normalized, just before both groups were overtaken by an external power. In the 13th century, Chinese records reveal that the Bruneian Sultanate controlled the region, including Ma'ai and Maynila. The records provide limited information, but note that these areas eventually regained their independence. By the early 15th century, they had certainly regained independence, as evidenced by their leader, Raja Baguinda, who converted to Islam and ruled the newly established sultanate independently. Sometime before the 11th century, the Rajanate of Butuan emerged on the island of Mindanao. This kingdom had a mixed religious landscape, with the majority practicing Hinduism, while the leadership followed Buddhism. Butuan was renowned for its expertise in gold and maintained extensive trade relations with China and various kingdoms on the Indochina Peninsula. There were other significant independent polities about which less is known. These entities had separate trade agreements with neighboring states and were influenced by different cultures. For example, the Cabaloan barangay was heavily influenced by China and Japan, which was evident in their clothing styles and cultural practices, such as blackening their teeth. Other polities, such as Ma'ai and Pulilu, were trade partners with China. Additionally, there is evidence of conflicts initiated by Filipinos between the people of the Visayan region of the archipelago and towns along the Chinese coastline. In the decades leading up to European contact, the Bruneian Sultanate once again expanded into the Philippines. They began with Tondo and Manila Bay, aiming to break their monopoly on the Chinese trade of certain goods. Their efforts were successful, and in 1500 they established Selurong, also known as the Kingdom of Manila, as a vassal state. Their leader, Sultan Bolkiah, strengthened ties by marrying into the ruling family of the Sultanate of Sulu, thereby linking the two powers. The first contact between the people of the Philippines and Europeans occurred in 1521, when the Spanish expedition to circumnavigate the globe, led by Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan, made a stop there. On March 14, 1521, they anchored off Suluan Island in the central part of the archipelago. Magellan planted the Spanish flag, naming the islands the Islas de San Lazaro. The following day, they landed on nearby Homonhon Island, where Magellan met with the leaders of the Cebu and Limasawa peoples. Their leader, Raja Humabon, had an extensive conversation with Magellan and subsequently decided to convert to Catholicism. Spanish priests from the expedition baptized him, his wife, and many members of their household. Following the tradition of adopting a new or additional name at baptism, the Raja became Carlos, in honor of King Charles I of Spain. His wife took the name Juana in honor of the king's mother, Joanna, daughter of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. The Raja then commanded the people of the nearby islands to welcome Magellan and his men, provide them with supplies, and convert to Catholicism. His influence is evident as most of these people followed his lead and joined the church. However, Datu Lapu-Lapu, a chief on the island of Mactan, refused to comply. Not much is known about him prior to these events, except that he was a rival to Humabon for regional influence. He opposed the idea of conversion and prevented his neighboring leader Datu Zula from sending gifts to Magellan. This led Humabon and Zula to suggest that Magellan address the matter with a personal visit. Magellan viewed this as an opportunity to demonstrate both his strength and his willingness to form alliances with the local peoples. On April 27, 1521, Magellan and his force landed on Mactan, where they were immediately met with a barrage of spears, rocks, and arrows. The initial attack was more demoralizing than deadly for the Spanish. Offshore, the Spanish forces observed the attack and fired their muskets and crossbows, but they were too far away to be effective. Magellan's next move was to advance toward the native village and set fire to some of the houses. This intensified the Mactan defense. Magellan was immobilized by a poisoned arrow to the leg, and many of his men were quickly killed. According to his chronicler, Antonio Pigafetta, the attackers concentrated on Magellan, allowing a few of the Spanish to escape. Lapu-Lapu also ensured that all the natives who assisted the Spanish in their attack were killed. This did not include Raja Humabon and Datu Zula. Despite their promise to fight alongside the Spanish, they remained uninvolved. Raja Humabon attempted to ransom the body of the Portuguese navigator, but Lapu-Lapu rejected all his offers. Observing the attitudes of his peers, Humabon appeared to renounce his conversion, even going so far as to kill some of the Spanish soldiers who had escaped the battle. The expedition continued its journey and returned to Spain the following year, completing the first circumnavigation of the earth. It was 4 decades before the Spanish or Portuguese made another attempt to claim any territory in the Philippines.